In many respects, policing is broken.
Victims we rarely hear about from other communities of color.
It's oftentimes hard for people to tell their stories.
Okay, so let's pray for a minute for Tommy.
Their families left behind, fighting to hold law enforcement accountable.
I don't know, it'd probably be far-fetched, but an apology or an admitting of the wrongdoing.
Now, how will those who wear the badge build that trust?
We're at a place where we can make it better and make a difference.
Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Rayshard Brooks. Black Lives Matter protesters chant their names. They are the faces of the movement, and with good reason.
There's a recent study that was released where the lifetime likelihood of being murdered by a police officer is 1 in 1,000 for Black men.
That's a much higher rate than if you're white. Thanks for joining us for Facing Race. I'm Joyce Taylor. Tonight, we're continuing to talk about policing. The impact on the Black community is front and center right now, but what's the reality for other people of color? Take a look at this list of names: Jacqueline Salyers, John T. Williams, Renee Davis, Tim Elliott, Tommy Lay, Antonio Zambrano Montes, Juan Salinas, and Michael L. Taylor. Do you know who they are? How they died? They were all killed by law enforcement, all right here in the state of Washington. They were Asian, Hispanic, and Native American. So now let this sink in for a second. Native Americans per capita are killed by law enforcement more than any other group. Natalie Swaby tells us more about this statistic that we just don't hear about.
So say their names. Say John T. Williams. Say Charlene Lyles. Say Jackie. All of those things, those voices have to be said, and we have to be part of the conversation.
Abigail Echohawk is the Chief Research Officer at the Seattle Indian Health Board, one of two experts King 5 consulted with to learn about racism facing Native people. The other is Matthew Fletcher, the Foundation Professor of Law at Michigan State University. Both addressed an important topic for their community: police shootings.
Put the knife down.
What do the numbers show? How much does it affect this minority group?
According to reports from the CDC, a lot.
When Native people confront the police, they are killed at a higher rate than any other demographic in the United States.
We knew before data was ever published. We had the stories that were told mouth to mouth, social media to social media, but we never saw those elevated outside of our own community.
She means for people outside their community, this seemed to be a little-known fact. Nobody seemed to talk about it or even care.
Do we even matter is sometimes the question that folks are asking themselves in these larger communities where our deaths aren't acknowledged in the same way that others are.
One case that did capture attention involved a Puyallup tribal member, Jackie Salyers. A Tacoma police officer nearly 5 years ago killed this mother of 4 who was also pregnant with her 5th child.
This is like a nightmare to me. It's like something you see in a movie. And it felt like a piece of my heart had been ripped out.
This is Lisa Earl Rideout, Jackie's mother. She sat down with us, and so did family friend Sylvia Miller. They both have agonizing questions about that night, including how did a nearby security camera happen to not be working right at the time of the shooting.
But in this case, this was not caught on camera, right?
So there were cameras, but they all seemed to malfunction at that time.
That night, Jackie was in the driver's seat of a parked car with her boyfriend, a convicted felon with outstanding warrants. Police approached them to make an arrest. Instead of complying, police say Jackie started up the car and drove right toward one of them, prompting that officer to shoot through the car window, striking Jackie 4 times.
I miss her. I miss her every day.
The Pierce County prosecutor found the police officer's actions on that January night to be justified. But that did not satisfy Jackie's family, who says an outside agency should have conducted a thorough investigation.
So they did their own internal investigation, which is reviewed by a secondary panel, which is made up of 4 of 6, 4 other officers and 2 communicable. So it was justified twice. After 12 days, Aaron Joseph and Scott Campbell were able to return back to work at business as usual.
That's Jackie's uncle, James Rideout, who helped organize protests in the streets.
And people came in with shirts that said "Justice for Jackie." I'm talking all over South Dakota. All these people had sent messages to say how much support we have, you know, and everybody feeling that we're doing the right thing. We're doing the right thing.
The family didn't stop at marching. They advocated for a change in the law in 2018, Initiative 940, which passed. It mandates an independent investigation when officers use deadly force.
You know, we brought all of our resources to the table to help change this law.
But I always want them to remember justice for Jackie is justice for all. That's what I want them to remember.
Her family and friends don't want the attention on this case to be unique. They want the voice of all Native people included in the conversation.
People's eyes are opening up, not just minorities, everybody's. I'm surprised how many individuals see the light that we are treated different.
That all we want is for our sons to come home alive. And that is our unity right now.
From Native Americans, let's now look at police and the Asian community. Asians are killed by law enforcement at a significantly lower rate than blacks and Native Americans. But when they are, there are different cultural issues at play. Mimi Jung looks at that, and she tells us about the case of a 20-year-old Vietnamese-American man shot and killed by a King County deputy just hours before his graduation.
Let's make some egg roll. In Vietnamese, we call chả giò.
Beneath the laughter, conversation.
She loves cooking. She always smile.
The liveliness of family that fills this South Seattle home.
Okay, so let's pray for a minute for Tommy. I invite Tommy to come over.
There is a void, an emptiness that just doesn't ever seem to go away. It's an unmistakable grief that comes with losing a child, nephew, grandson. Like many Asian immigrant families, Tommy Lay grew up with 3 generations under one roof.
What has the past 3 years been like for you?
We have, Christmases that he's not around. We still celebrate his birthdays, even though he's not here. And we just miss him, and it's been difficult knowing that he's not, around.
In 2017, a King County Sheriff's deputy shot and killed Tommy. He was just 20, set to graduate high school the next day. Police told the family Tommy was threatening neighbors with a knife and charged toward deputies with the weapon in hand.
We couldn't believe it. That's not Tommy.
How could Tommy, a dedicated student, avid reader, and chess player who loved his grandmother more than anything, suddenly become a violent criminal?
He's so gentle, so obedient.
It just was so shameful, and they just villainized him and made him look like a criminal or some bad person that deserved to, be killed because he was attacking, people and officers. It just made, our family look bad and Tommy look bad. And then to find out, that's not even the truth.
The truth is, the deputy shot Tommy in the back, and he wasn't holding a knife, it was a ballpoint pen. The King County Sheriff's Office cleared the deputy of any wrongdoing.
Tommy's family didn't accept that outcome. They filed this civil rights lawsuit against the county and the deputy, demanding accountability and going public about it. A brave and difficult step for many Asian immigrant families.
Asian Americans are often depicted as a model minority who live without any problems, who do not experience racism, or if they experience it, do not speak up about it or challenge it.
Diane Narasaki is the former executive director of Asian Counseling and Referral Service and a dedicated police accountability advocate.
She says the model minority stereotype characterizes Asians as smart, hardworking, able to achieve greater educational and financial success in our society compared to other minority groups. It's a label and a myth that is harmful for a number of reasons.
That leads to a discounting of Asian Americans as people of color who have many of the same experiences as other people of color, also experience racism.
She applauds the Lay family for going public with their pursuit for justice when so many other Asian families stay silent. Narasaki says because of that, cases of police mistreatment against Asians are often unreported.
Why do you think a number of cases involving Asian Americans in our community who have had negative interactions with the police have not been publicized? We don't hear about these cases.
2/3 roughly of our community are first-generation Americans. They're immigrants and refugees. And in the case of refugees, may have fled countries where challenging the police is done at the risk of your life. There is the language barrier as well as cultural barrier. It's oftentimes hard for people.
Diane Narasaki is describing a family precisely like Tommy's. His grandmother fled communist Vietnam 30 years ago with her 5 children, escaping persecution and hoping for a better life in America. The Lays are an immigrant family who came to this country and trusted in the system.
Do you think that people would be shocked to hear at some of the incidences or cases involving members of our Asian community and the interactions with police?
I do think some people would be shocked that we, who are oftentimes burdened by the racist model minority stereotype, also experience these problems, because the model minority stereotype plays a function. It's used to undermine all other communities of color. The premise is that if the Asian community can surmount difficulties and achieve success, then all other communities of colors should be able to do so as well. And it doesn't take into account the history and the systemic structural racism which has made succeeding so very difficult for so many in communities of color.
An outside review of the Tommy Lay case this year blasted the internal investigation conducted by the sheriff's office, saying it failed to include critical facts before determining the shooting was justified.
Everything is coming out is all lie, cover up, so make our families more pain.
Pain, they hope, will lead to change. Should the Lay family win their lawsuit, they want to donate some money or create a scholarship for students at Tommy's school as a way for his legacy to live on.
What does justice look like to you?
I think for us it's, I don't know, it'd probably be far-fetched, but an apology or an admitting of the wrongdoing from the sheriff's department and the officer. I mean, it's hard because all we really want is to have Tommy back here with us.
No one has been charged in Tommy Lay's killing. It's what we've seen across the country for years. Public outrage following decisions to not charge officers and deputies who kill unarmed people. Most recently, a grand jury decided the Louisville officers who shot and killed Breonna Taylor would not face criminal charges in connection with her death. So how often do cops face charges for using deadly force? Kristen Ayers asked a former police officer who has spent the past 16 years tracking and analyzing the numbers.
I'm Phil Stinson. I'm a professor of criminal justice at Bowling Green State University in Ohio, and I study police crime.
Phil Stinson leads the Ohio-based Police Integrity Research Group. He's created one of the most comprehensive databases in the country on law enforcement crimes.
What does your data show?
Well, we now know that about 1,000 times each year, on-duty police officers shoot and kill someone. And yet only a handful of times each year, an average of about 8 times a year, is an officer charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from one of those on-duty shootings. Since 2005, just 121 officers across the country have been charged with murder or manslaughter resulting from an on-duty shooting. We've only seen 7 officers actually convicted of murder during that time period.
How do we really know if an officer was using force to protect his or her own life versus if other factors were at play there? I mean, how do we make those determinations?
They have to apply the law to the facts of the case as best they can. One of the problems that I see is that if you or I went out and shot and killed someone today, the responding investigators, the police chief, prosecutors would all consider that from the get-go as a criminal matter, a criminal homicide case. They would treat the scene as a crime scene. They would make certain notifications in a certain order. They would interview witnesses in a certain way. But when a police officer is involved in an on-duty shooting, it seems in many places the responding investigators, the police chief, police supervisors, prosecutors, they all start with a different set of assumptions. They seem to start with the assumption this was an on-duty shooting that was probably legally justified.
Can you talk to me about how we can balance this need for greater accountability for officers whose actions are rooted in racism versus, allowing room for officers to react when shootings are justified, when someone is threatening to commit suicide by cop, for example?
Yeah, these are difficult situations, and police officers are really sent out to perform impossible tasks. I mean, I don't think there are any easy fixes. Certainly, most police officers serve honorably, but we really need to rethink what is it we want police officers to do and what type of people do we want to be police officers. And those are two core issues.
There are a lot of police officers that feel that they are being unfairly targeted right now and are sort of under a microscope. Is it fair to be sort of judging all officers by the standard that we see when we hear stories of Breonna Taylor or George Floyd?
Probably not, but another way to look at this is, most people weren't paying very close attention to issues involving police brutality before about 6 years ago. And I think that the police are under a microscope, and I'm not so sure that's not a good thing. I think it is a good thing. We expect an awful lot of our police, and frankly, we're seeing these things time and again that are problematic. I mean, if you look at the data with more than 1,000 people shot and killed by on-duty police officers in this country, that's an average of more than 2, almost 3 a day. That's really shocking to most people.
There was a Gallup poll that just came out that said that confidence in police has dropped below 50% for the first time since that poll began.
I hope it's a wake-up call for law enforcement officers and for law enforcement agencies. It's a huge problem. Many police departments and sheriff's offices across the country are having difficulty recruiting young people to want to work in those agencies as sworn officers.
What would it take to restore public trust in law enforcement?
A systemic change to policing. We've got to get away from the police use of firearms on such a regular basis. We've got to stop police brutality. We've got to stop the killing of people of color. It's just a huge problem. And people of all walks of life are now paying attention to this. And I don't think that we can get past this until we really figure out a way to change the core values of policing and the police subculture at all of the agencies across the country.
So how do we change those core values? This spring's Black Lives Matter demonstrations have put law enforcement officers across the country in a uniquely difficult position. They're facing increased scrutiny over police brutality and calls to defund their departments. And as the backlash builds, we've seen documented cases of increased hostility, even violence against some for simply wearing a badge. A lot of officers either don't want to or aren't allowed to talk about the pressures they're facing, especially in front of a camera. We reached out to 10 different departments in Western Washington to try to talk with rank and file officers for tonight's show. Most declined or never answered. But a few times over the past months, a few officers have shared with us what it's like on the other side of that protest line.
What is it like being a female African-American law enforcement officer in Washington State?
I love my job. I mean, it takes a specific individual, a human being, to do the job of a police officer. We're willing to give our lives for the sake of that oath of service to complete strangers.
The whole reason why I got into this job is because I wanted to make a change and be that bridge, that open line of communication for my community who's been pretty underserved.
What was your reaction when you first saw the video of George Floyd being killed?
It was horror. It actually made me physically ill.
I mean, there's 250,000 deaths on the operating table each year in this nation. Does that mean every doctor's bad? No, not by a long shot. I mean, on average, police officers across this nation, unfortunately, have to shoot about 1,000 people. I mean, you compare 1,000 people to 250,000 operating room deaths.
The cries of frustration that we're seeing across the nation, yes, is real. On the same token, people got to know that we're also reaching out, trying to do everything we can in this department to rectify some of the issues that we've been facing.
We deal with crime, we deal with saving people, and yet we're vilified and we're pushed aside as if we're outcasts, when all we want to do is serve this community.
They threw a homemade explosive of some sort at the wall of the precinct. It just felt like they were there to hurt us.
I've been called, Uncle Tom, a traitor. I've been called that numerous times by people that look just like me.
I have been yelled at to quit my job. I feel like I am a child caught between two fighting parents, that cultural identity and that law enforcement identity.
I can take this uniform off, but I can never take my skin off.
Law enforcement blood, it is something that runs through my veins. Right or wrong, it does define me, so to speak, just as much as my color does. This is me, this is my truth, and I am here to fight the good fight.
Do you have an experience with police that you want to share? Text the word STORY to 206-448-4545.
I think one of the things we have to really be careful about is not stereotyping anything and anyone because of the job they do, the melanin in their skin, the color of their hair, all those things. We have to make sure that we're finding a place where we find what we have in common and what unites us.
The top cop, female and black. Carmen Best was Seattle's first African-American police chief in the department's 151-year history. Before she stepped down, her department faced major cuts, but one person was left out of the conversation, Carmen Best herself. Tonight we ask her, was it because she's black? Back on the track. Welcome back to Lincoln.
I know, this is amazing.
It brings Carmen Best right back to high school, where she learned early winning isn't everything.
If you're not going to win, did you improve? Did you get a little better?
She didn't just get better. At the age of 17, she was among the best, breaking the girls' state record in the 1,600-meter relay. It was the culmination of practice, discipline, disappointment, and determination, all lessons she carries with her now.
Well, when times are tough, we know that you have to keep trying.
Best knows a thing or two about tough times. In 2 wide-ranging interviews, she talked to us about her rise to the top of the Seattle Police Department, racism that she's encountered along the way, and what led to her departure.
We will not be divided!
In May, protests erupt in Seattle against police brutality and systemic racism. After the police death of George Floyd, protesters took over 6 city blocks.
Leaving the precinct was not my decision.
Best lashed out after her officers were forced to vacate the East Precinct. Police were called out, criticized for using tear gas and blast balls against demonstrators. As demands to defund the police grew louder, the council responded, voting to slash $4 million from the SPD budget, putting 100 officers' jobs on the chopping block, and cutting the chief's salary by 40%. Do you think the city council would be treating you this way if you were a white male police chief?
Have you ever seen a white male police chief sidelined and treated the way that I've been treated?
I can't say that I have in Seattle.
I bet you haven't.
So, after 2 years in the top job, that was it.
I'm done. Can't do it.
It was her way, she says, of getting out of the way.
Thank you all for all the work.
I think it's difficult for people of color to look at what happened to you and not see that it's partly about race.
It's hard for people not to, make that assumption, but often I say, I don't know. I found it very disheartening, the way that they went about singling me out.
We reached out to the Seattle City Council Chair, Lisa Herbold. She provided a statement pointing out that she reached out to correct Best's salary cut and added, I do wish I'd known how to be more intentionally supportive of Chief Best in recognition of her extremely difficult position as a Black woman leader in a traditionally male-dominated employment sector, while still fulfilling my responsibility as an elected. Do you think it was their way of putting you, Carmen Best, in her place?
I absolutely think that was some of their intention. You know, I challenged their thoughts. I said what I believe their decision making was not inclusive and that it was quite frankly reckless. And I honestly just did not want to continue in that vein, to have other people's jobs and lives affected by the mean girl attitude.
The timing of Best's departure comes as those crying out for justice are losing patience.
Of course, we don't want officers to abuse us, to beat us, to treat us wrong and unfairly and unjustly. Nobody wants that. But we do want somebody to respond if we're victimized and crime is occurring.
And yet, she has some of the same concerns as many of you. That's right, this career officer and former chief has had to warn her family members about how to behave around police. She's given them the talk too. Is that a talk that you expect your daughters will have with their children?
It is my greatest hope and prayer that they don't need to have that talk. It really is.
They will, don't you think?
They might. You know, if I just say that they're going to and that's that, then I just can't, you know, operate in an area where I just don't have any hope for the future. I really do hope for the future that we get to a point where, you know, institutional racism, racist acts, bias, that we get to a place where that is so rare, it's non-existent, you know. And if we don't work toward that and we don't have hope for the future, then what's the point?
Hope for the future, informed by her past.
Many of us who lived here, went to school here, still stay in touch.
Best took us back to her old neighborhood. Do you have fond memories?
I do.
Best believes it's important to learn from the past. It's why she's a believer that Black lives matter.
People have asked about Black Lives Matter, Blue Lives Matter, All Lives Matter. And what I say to them is I think the reason that people point out specifically Black Lives Matter is because African Americans have over the history had a long history of being oppressed and have had, particularly with law enforcement, have had law enforcement be a part of that oppression in many ways and used to maintain the status quo.
She's looking ahead, non-committal, but not ruling out a return to uniform. For now, she plans to enjoy her newest role of grandmother. If there is one thing that you'd like to see change within the lifetime of your grandchild, what would it be?
You know, Joyce, we have to strive for equity. And I absolutely believe we shouldn't ignore the fact that we all have our differences, but when we change the mindset to we embrace and appreciate those differences, you know, that's the key thing. And I want to hope, you know, I absolutely believe that at some point, you know, we'll get there.
Now it's time for Frequently Awkward Questions, the part of our show where our experts answer your anonymous questions that you may be too afraid to ask. Our question from a Bellingham viewer: why do we need to talk about race when we should all worry about pulling together? Why does it have to be divided? The answer comes from Robin DiAngelo, author of the New York Times bestseller, White Fragility.
So I would ask this questioner to think about any social problem that they would say the best approach to that social problem is not to talk about it. Suicide, depression, sexual assault, domestic violence, rape in the military, eating disorders. Best approach, don't talk about it so we're all together. And yet when it comes to race, we want to say, let's not talk about it. But who does that serve? In any one of those cases, who is served by not talking about the elephant that's in the room?
If you have a question for our experts and you want to see it in an upcoming episode of Facing Race, just text FAQ to 206-448-4545. Next week on Facing Race, the question we asked that stopped some people cold. And brought others to tears. Now we're talking about how race impacts our children.
Your child might have been born racially innocent, but they don't stay that way for very long.
And what the best-selling author of White Fragility says you can do about it.
We have to put pressure that this is important.
Thanks for spending part of your evening with us and for sharing your stories. And we hope to see you again next week for Facing Race. Good night.